Pregnant wife vanishes without a trace. Dark secrets revealed. True crime stories. Hook. What happens when the darkness inside you becomes too powerful to ignore? When the ones you've lost come back, but not in the way you expect. Watch as David's journey leads him into a confrontation with his darkest fears and a shocking revelation that could change everything. Stay tuned for the twist that will leave you breathless. The phone rang, slicing through the stillness of the night. Her husband, David, stared at it, his fingers frozen above the screen. The house was eerily quiet. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator broke the silence. Then, the sound of a door creaking. He whipped his head around. Nothing, but the feeling of eyes on him lingered. The house was large, old, with creaky floors and cracked windows. It had always felt like it held secrets. Now, those secrets were surfacing. David pushed the phone away, unwilling to answer. But a knot twisted in his stomach. It had been 2 days since his wife, Emma, disappeared. No trace of her. No note. Nothing. He walked to the kitchen. The air was heavy, thick with something unspoken. His fingers brushed the counter. A glass, still full of water, sat there. Emma had been drinking from it before she vanished. David's breath caught in his throat. Had she known something? A chill crept up his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the door that led to the basement. It had always been locked, but the lock was undone now. He could hear something, a soft thud from below, a whisper, almost imperceptible, drifting up through the wooden floorboards. David hesitated. The shadows seemed to grow longer, thicker, as if they were alive. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the basement door. His fingers brushed the doorknob. It was cold. His hand trembled as he turned it. The door creaked open. He stepped down 1 foot after the other. The air grew colder. The faint sound of scratching reached his ears. Then a low, guttural voice. He couldn't make out the words, but they sounded familiar. Suddenly, he heard a sharp intake of breath. A woman's voice. Emma. David rushed down the stairs. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Emma, tied to a chair, eyes wide with terror, her face pale, a figure looming over her. Someone he knew. The truth, hidden in plain sight, was now undeniable. David froze, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure turned slowly. It was John, his best friend. But something was off. The look in John's eyes was dark, unfathomable. David's breath caught. He took a step forward, but his legs felt like lead. John's lips curled into a cold smile. "David," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Emma's eyes darted between them, wide with fear. "John, what are you doing?" David stammered. John's smile widened. "You never noticed, did you? All these years, you never saw it." David's mind raced. What was John talking about? "I don't understand," David's voice cracked. Emma strained against the ropes, her eyes pleading. John stepped closer. The air seemed to grow thicker with every movement. "You thought you knew me," John continued. "You thought we were friends." David's stomach churned. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. But what was he talking about? John's eyes gleamed with a strange, unsettling intensity. "You never knew about Emma, did you? Never knew what she was hiding?" David's heart skipped a beat. Emma? Hiding something? The woman he'd loved, trusted? What was John implying? His gaze flicked to Emma, her face pale, lips trembling. She couldn't speak, but her eyes, they spoke volumes. David took a step forward. His voice came out in a whisper. "Emma, what's going on? What is he talking about?" Emma's eyes widened further, her lips mouthing something. The words were silent, but the message was clear. "Run." John's hand shot out suddenly, grabbing Emma by the hair. David's blood ran cold. Stay away from her, David growled. John's grip tightened, but his smile remained. She's mine now. David's pulse raced. He lunged forward, but in a blur, John was already on him. The world spun as John's hand gripped his throat, pushing him back against the cold stone wall. "Don't you see, David?" John hissed. It was always about her. Always. David gasped for air, his vision dimming. But then, something snapped. Adrenaline surged through him, and with a desperate scream, he shoved John off. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the door slammed shut. David was left in the darkness, breathless. Emma's terrified face stared back at him from the shadows. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Get out. Now, before it's too late." David's blood ran cold. The door to the basement was locked again, the handle refusing to turn. He could hear Emma's frantic breathing on the other side, her voice shaking. "David, please." A cold sweat drenched his forehead. He pounded on the door, desperation rising in his chest. But there was no answer. A sudden noise made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above. David's heart raced. The unmistakable sound of John's voice, low and mocking, filtered down. He thinks he can save her. David turned quickly, his eyes darting around the basement. He needed a way out, a plan. He spotted something in the corner, an old crowbar, half hidden beneath a pile of forgotten boxes. He grabbed it, his hands trembling as he lifted it. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. David rushed to the door again, battering it with all his strength. The wood splintered with each blow, and then finally a crack, enough to see a sliver of light from the other side. He pressed his shoulder against the door and shoved. The door flew open, and there she was, Emma, tied, terrified, her eyes wide with fear. But John was gone. David reached for her, but she recoiled. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too late." David's breath caught in his throat. "What are you talking about?" "We need to leave now." Emma's eyes locked onto his, the fear deep in them. "I didn't want you to know." David's pulse quickened. "What is it, Emma? What's happening?" She swallowed hard, tears streaking her face. "I wasn't just hiding from John. I was hiding from myself." David's mind spun. "Hiding from yourself? What does that mean?" The room seemed to darken as she spoke, her voice shaking with each word. "I wasn't the person you thought I was. Not even close." Her gaze turned downward, towards the floor. A shift in the air. The very walls seemed to hum with a strange energy. "I've been running from the truth," she whispered. Suddenly, a heavy thud echoed from above. The house creaked again, louder this time. David's eyes shot up. The footsteps. They were closer. And then he understood. John hadn't left. He was still here waiting. But now, so it was something else. The floorboards groaned, and Emma's eyes widened in terror. "We have to go," David urged, grabbing her hands. But she pulled away, her face pale. "Don't. He's already here." And then, without warning, the shadows moved, the shadows shifted, creeping across the walls like living things. David's heart raced. The temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't just John anymore. Something far darker had entered. Emma's eyes were wide with dread, her breath shallow. "He's coming," she whispered. David turned in every direction, his mind racing for answers. But the darkness seemed to swallow the room whole. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. A low, guttural growl echoed from the corner. David spun toward the noise. In the dim light, he saw it. A figure, tall and twisted, standing in the shadows. Its features were barely discernible, but its eyes glowed, piercing red, full of rage. Emma's voice cracked. "You can't stop him." David stepped back, panic surging. "What is that? What is he?" Emma's eyes never left the creature. I've been running from both of them. From John, and from what he's become. David's head spun. What did she mean? The figure in the corner stirred, stepping forward. David could see it more clearly now. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs seemed unnaturally long. Its eyes fixed on him, locking onto his every movement. A whisper reached his ears, like wind, but with a voice that wasn't human. Leave this place. Leave now, before it's too late. David's breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back, but the creature followed, its eyes never leaving him. Suddenly, Emma lunged forward, her hands shaking. We can't escape. Not now. David's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? We have to get out of here. Now. But Emma's grip tightened around his arm, desperate. John, he made a deal. A dark deal. And it's already too late. David's mind reeled. The creature edged closer, its gaze unblinking. He could feel its cold presence, pressing against him like a suffocating weight. What did John do? David choked out. Emma's eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. He didn't just make a deal. He summoned something ancient, and it's using him. Using both of us. A deep, hollow laugh echoed from the darkness. John's voice, now distorted, dripped with malice. You didn't think you could escape, did you? The creature's form shifted again, like a shadow wrapping itself around the room. David tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. Emma, too, stood frozen, her face pale with terror. David, she whispered, we're not alone here. We never were. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness overwhelming, and the sound of John's laughter echoed louder. Then, with a sudden surge of cold, everything went silent. For one horrifying moment, David wondered if they were already lost. The silence was suffocating. David's mind raced, his thoughts jumbled in a chaotic mess. The creature, John, Emma, everything felt like it was closing in on him. Then he heard it again, a soft scraping sound from the far corner of the room. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, growing longer with every passing second. David turned, his body stiff with fear. Emma's eyes were wide, locked on the creature, unable to tear herself away. It was moving again, its limbs jerking in unnatural angles. A sharp, wet sound followed. David's blood ran cold as the creature's face emerged from the dark. It was John, but not the John he knew. His friend's features were twisted, his eyes now black as coal, void of any humanity. John grinned, the expression stretched and wrong. I told you, David, his voice rasped. You never should have come here. David's pulse hammered in his throat. I don't understand, he gasped, stepping backward. Emma's grip on his arm tightened. It's too late. Don't you see? The deal, it's already been sealed. We're part of it now. John took a slow, deliberate step toward them, the air growing heavier with each movement. You should have left when you had the chance, David, he whispered, his voice thick with menace. David backed up, panic surging through him. Get away from us, he shouted, but his voice barely echoed through the suffocating stillness. John's form shifted again, no longer entirely human, but something much darker. Emma, her face twisted in terror, pulled David closer. Listen to me, she pleaded, her voice frantic. We are both trapped here. The moment John made that pact, we were bound to it. And now there's no escaping. David's mind struggled to process it. This can't be real. What are you talking about? You're not making sense. John's laugh echoed in the room, harsh and unhinged. You still don't get it, do you? His voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. You think you can fight this? You think you can save her? David's vision blurred with fear, his heart thundering in his chest. He had to act. He had to do something. The darkness was closing in, the creature's presence suffocating, and he knew time was running out. But as his mind raced, Emma's voice cut through the chaos, quiet but firm. "There's one way out, David," she said, her voice trembling. "But you have to be willing to do the unthinkable." David's eyes locked onto hers, confusion and fear flooding him. "What do you mean?" he asked, barely able to breathe. Emma took a deep, shaky breath. "You have to destroy him." David looked at John, or what was left of him, the creature that had once been his friend. "Do it, David," Emma urged. "If you don't, we're both lost forever." The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The creature, John, shifted once more, its grin widening. David's pulse raced as he understood the gravity of Emma's words. He had to make a choice, and there was no going back. That David's mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Destroy John? Destroy his best friend? The thought felt like a nightmare, something he couldn't grasp, couldn't comprehend. But Emma's terrified eyes were locked onto his, urging him with a silent plea. The creature, John, took another slow step forward, his distorted form looming closer. David felt the coldness in the air, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing against him, closing in. "Do it, David," Emma whispered again, her voice trembling. David glanced at her. Her hands were shaking, her eyes filled with a desperation he had never seen before. He turned to face the twisted form of John, now just a shell of what he had been. A low growl rumbled from the creature's throat as it moved toward him. David's breath caught in his throat. "I'm sorry, John," he whispered, the words feeling foreign, unnatural. But the creature didn't hear him. It lunged, faster than he could react. David stumbled backward, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. In a panic, he reached for the crowbar, still gripped tightly in his hand, and swung it with all his might. The impact was sickening, a heavy thud, followed by a crack that echoed through the room. John, no, the creature, let out a guttural scream, a sound so inhuman it made David's stomach twist. It staggered back, its form flickering, unstable. For a brief moment, it looked almost human again, the face of his old friend appearing through the darkness. But then, with a horrifying shriek, the creature's true form reasserted itself. David's hands trembled as he raised the crowbar again, his eyes locked on the creature's twisted smile. "Please," he muttered under his breath, "please let this be the end." He swung the crowbar once more, striking the creature's chest. This time it didn't move. The room fell still. The oppressive weight of the darkness lifted, leaving only silence. David's breath came in ragged gasps. He looked down at the creature, its form now crumpled and still on the floor, a faint, unnatural glow flickering from its hollow eyes. "But, Emma," David turned to her. She was kneeling on the floor, her face pale, her hands clasped in front of her. Her eyes were empty, vacant. He reached for her, his heart pounding. "Emma, are you okay?" She didn't respond. Her body was still, her face locked in an expression of resignation. David's fingers brushed her cheek, but there was no warmth, only cold. He jerked his hand away, a chill settling over him. It wasn't just John that had been destroyed. Emma was gone too. No, it couldn't be. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. No, please. Emma, wake up." But she didn't move. David's heart sank. He couldn't breathe. The truth crashed down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. The deal had never been about John alone. It had always been about Emma. And now it was too late for both of them. That David's hands trembled as he cradled Emma's lifeless form. The reality of the moment felt like it was pulling him into a suffocating abyss. His mind refused to accept it. No, this couldn't be happening. He shook her again, harder this time, his voice rising in desperation. "Emma, please, wake up. Come on." But her body was cold, stone cold. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them. No life, no warmth. David's stomach twisted. His breaths came in shallow, panicked gasps. And then he felt it. A shift in the air. The room grew darker again, heavier, as if something had moved in the shadows. David froze, his pulse racing. A voice, low, guttural, and familiar, slithered from the darkness. "You did this, David." David's heart stopped. He slowly turned his head, the sound of his breath louder than his thoughts. John's distorted figure was standing in the doorway. But it wasn't John anymore. Not really. The creature's eyes burned with a furious glow, its skin stretched unnaturally tight across its skull, its grin widening grotesquely. David backed away, his hand still clutching Emma's cold, unmoving body. "I told you it was too late," the creature hissed, its voice cracking like broken glass. David's mind spun. It was still here, still alive. But how? How had he survived? The creature stepped forward, its limbs jerking in unnatural motions. "John is gone," it sneered, "but his essence, his soul, is mine now, and you are the one who sealed it." David shook his head, disbelieving. "No, I killed you." The creature's laugh sent chills down David's spine, its voice echoing with madness. "You think you killed me? You think it's that easy?" It took another step closer. "You're only just beginning to understand." David's legs trembled beneath him, his eyes locked onto the creature. "No," he breathed. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." The creature reached out, its hand like a claw, fingers stretching toward David's face. "You took her from me," it hissed. "Now you'll join her." David stumbled back, his hand gripping the crowbar for a final, desperate swing. But the creature was faster. It grabbed his wrist, its grip unbreakable, pulling him toward it with inhuman strength. David fought, struggling to break free, but the creature's hand tightened, its coldness seeping into his skin. "You should have run, David," it growled, pulling him closer. "Now there's nowhere left to hide." David's breath quickened as the room began to darken again. The last thing he saw, before the darkness swallowed him whole, were Emma's lifeless eyes, still staring at him. And then there was nothing but David's body went limp in the creature's grasp, the weight of his own defeat settling over him like an iron shroud. He couldn't fight anymore. He couldn't even move. The darkness closed in around him, suffocating, overwhelming. The creature's fingers tightened, drawing him closer. He could feel its icy breath, the vile presence pressing against him, the sound of its distorted voice echoing in his ears. "Look at what you've done," it whispered, the words dripping with venom. "Look at what you've become." David's mind was a fog of terror and disbelief. It was happening, everything Emma had warned him about. The deal, the pact. He was trapped in it, just like her. He couldn't breathe. But something stirred within him, some faint shred of defiance. He couldn't just let it end like this, not like her. David's fingers clenched around the crowbar, still in his hand, cold and heavy. With a surge of adrenaline, he swung it upward, catching the creature off guard. The force of the blow sent it staggering back, releasing its grip on him. For a moment, the creature faltered, its form flickering again, its face twisting with an expression of pure rage. David gasped for breath, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "Stay away from me," he growled, his voice raw and hoarse. The creature's eyes blazed, the red glow intensifying, almost blinding. "You really think you can fight this? You think you have control?" It lunged again, but this time David was ready. He swung the crowbar with everything he had, striking the creature's chest with brutal force. It screamed, an awful, inhuman sound that reverberated through the walls. David's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, eyes never leaving the thing that had once been his friend. "You're not real," he whispered, trying to steady his breath. "You're not John. You never were." The creature's form flickered again, and for a split second, David saw the faintest trace of the man he had known, John. But it was fleeting. In the blink of an eye, it was gone, replaced by the monstrous thing that now stood before him. "You should have stayed away," the creature hissed, voice like nails on a chalkboard. It moved again, faster this time, its limbs jerking unnaturally. But David wasn't going to let it take him. With a final, desperate cry, he raised the crowbar one last time. The creature howled as the metal collided with its skull, the sound of shattering bone echoing in the small basement. The room seemed to freeze, and then the creature's body collapsed, falling to the floor with a sickening thud. David's hands were shaking, blood pounding in his ears, his breath ragged and shallow. The silence was deafening. For a long moment he stood there, staring at the motionless form on the floor. Had it worked? Was it finally over? But then, a soft sound reached his ears. A faint, almost imperceptible scratching noise. David's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, his heart leaping into his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Emma, but it wasn't her. Not anymore. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow, and her lips twisted into a smile that sent a wave of icy dread through him. "David," she whispered, her voice like the wind. "You never left. None of us did." David's heart stuttered in his chest as he stared at Emma, or whatever was left of her. Her eyes were black, void of any warmth or recognition, just the hollow emptiness that sent a chill through his entire being. "Emma," his voice was barely a whisper, his throat tight with fear. The figure that once was his wife stepped forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that looked sharper than they should have been. "You thought you could escape." The voice that came from her mouth wasn't hers. It was twisted, distorted, layered with something else. "But you're just as trapped as the rest of us." David's breath hitched. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, you're not her. You can't be." The figure that was Emma tilted its head, the smile on its face stretching further, as if mocking him. "Oh, but I am," it said, voice dripping with malice. "I'm everything you wanted me to be, and I'm everything you've destroyed." David backed away, his heart thumping painfully in his chest. "No, I killed it. I killed John. I killed the creature." The figure of Emma shook its head slowly. "Did you really?" it hissed. "You think it ends there? You think you've destroyed what's been built? You think you've won?" David felt his legs weaken beneath him, his knees threatening to buckle. The silence was unbearable now, heavy, filled with the promise of something terrible. Emma, or whatever it was, stepped closer, its smile stretching further with each movement, eyes never leaving his. "You didn't kill John," it whispered, voice thick with venom. "You only sealed your fate. Ours. All of us." David staggered backward, his mind reeling. The weight of everything he had done, everything he hadn't understood, came crashing down on him. "What have I done?" he gasped, his voice shaking with realization. Emma's figure stopped in front of him, too close, too cold. "You made the choice," it murmured. "You thought you could save her, save yourself. But in the end, there's nothing left but us." David reached out, his fingers trembling, as if he could touch her and somehow make it all right again. But she pulled back, faster than he could react, her eyes glowing now with an eerie red light. "You never understood," the thing that had been Emma said. "The pact isn't just for John. It's for all of us. And now we're bound together forever." The ground beneath David's feet seemed to shift, to pulse with a dark energy he couldn't escape. His eyes flicked to the motionless form of John on the floor, his twisted, broken body. The glow of its eyes had dimmed, but now it flickered faintly. You thought you killed us, the creature whispered, but we were never really alive to begin with. David's world tilted, the walls closing in as everything around him seemed to crumble away. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. The darkness had already taken hold, and now it was pulling him in. The figure of Emma, no, the thing that had once been Emma, reached out again, its cold fingers brushing his cheek. You're part of it now, David. It breathed, just like the rest of us. Forever. David felt himself slipping, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, his body frozen, mind shattering. There was no escape. And then everything went dark. The last thing he heard was the faint sound of Emma's distorted voice, singing a lullaby he'd once heard long ago. But now, it was only a whisper in the void, the darkness, wrapped around David like a suffocating blanket, pulling him deeper into the abyss. His limbs felt heavy, numb, as if he were no longer in control of his own body. His mind was a fractured blur, the remnants of his consciousness struggling to cling to something, anything. But there was nothing, only the cold, only the shadows, and then a whisper. It was soft at first, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. David, he froze. The voice, was it Emma? Was it real? He tried to move, but his body refused to respond. His heart pounded in his chest, a dull throb that seemed to echo through the emptiness. David. This time, the voice was clearer, more distinct. But it wasn't Emma. It was something else. Something familiar yet foreign. Something that sent a jolt of terror through his spine. He forced his eyes open, though the darkness was thick, impenetrable. A low, unnatural hum filled the air, vibrating through the very ground beneath him. And then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Emma. It was John, or the thing that had once been John. His body was misshapen, twisted, his face still bearing the faintest remnants of humanity, but now it was a grotesque mask of anguish and rage. His eyes, once kind and full of life, were now hollow and empty, filled with a darkness that made David's stomach twist. David's voice cracked, hoarse and broken. You're still here. John, or the thing wearing his skin, tilted his head, the smile that stretched across his face too wide, too wrong. You thought you could destroy us, it said, voice rasping, barely human. But the pact was never about death. It was about power. And now we are bound together. David's breath caught in his throat. No, you can't be. You're not real. The creature laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that reverberated through the blackness. Oh, but we are, it hissed. We're very real now, David. We're part of you, and you're part of us. David stumbled backward, trying to shake free from the grip the darkness had on him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Where's Emma? He gasped, his eyes frantically searching the shadows. What have you done to her? John's face twisted into a cruel grin. She's here, it murmured, just like you are. We all are. The air grew colder still, and the shadows thickened, wrapping themselves around David's legs, pulling him toward the ground. No, please, David screamed, struggling against the invisible forces. But the creature, John's form, moved closer, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. You can't escape, David, it whispered. The pact is complete. You're part of the curse now. David's chest tightened as the reality of what was happening settled in. He wasn't just in the dark anymore. He was in it. The darkness had consumed him, and there was no escaping its grip. The shadows began to press in from all sides, suffocating, crushing. David could feel his breath grow shallow as the cold closed in around him, numbing his body. And then, as if from a distant memory, the voice of Emma echoed through his mind, distant but clear. I tried to warn you, David. I tried to tell you. He wanted to scream, to fight, but the words got caught in his throat. He had failed her. He had failed them both. With one last, desperate effort, He twisted his body, trying to break free from the suffocating grip of the darkness. But it was too late. A pair of cold, dead eyes stared back at him from the shadows. And with that final gaze, the last of David's resistance crumbled. The darkness consumed him completely, and the world as he had known it was gone. There was only the void was endless, stretching out in every direction. There was no up, no down, just a crushing, all-encompassing blackness. David's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had happened, but everything felt distant, disconnected. His body was cold, numb, weightless. It was as if he had become part of the darkness itself, lost in the space between time and reality. But then a flicker, a tiny spark of light, appeared in the distance, distant yet inviting. It pulsed, almost like a heartbeat, drawing him in. David's heart pounded, something inside him desperate to reach it. He tried to move, but his limbs didn't obey. It was as though they no longer existed. The light pulsed again, stronger now, a faint glow that cut through the darkness. "Emma," he whispered, his voice raspy, as though it came from a faraway place. He tried to focus, to will himself closer to the light, but every movement felt like a struggle. And then, suddenly, it wasn't just the light anymore. Figures began to appear around it, their shapes shifting in and out of focus. Blurry at first, then clearer. Emma was there, but she was different. Her face, once so full of life and warmth, was now pale, her eyes hollow like the others. The same emptiness he had seen in John, no, in the thing that had been John, was reflected in her gaze. David's breath caught in his throat. "Emma, is it really you?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Her lips parted, but the words that came out were not hers. The voice was twisted, distorted, like it had been pulled through 100 layers of darkness. "It's too late, David." David staggered back, the weight of her words sinking into him like a cold stone. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "Please, no. I couldn't save you." Emma's form shimmered, flickering like a mirage, and for a moment, David thought he saw her, the real her, standing there, just as she had been, before everything had fallen apart, before the pact, before the darkness. But then it was gone, replaced by the thing that wore her skin. The creature's grin widened, cruel and cold, stretching impossibly wide. "You never understood," it whispered. "You never will." David's heart clenched. He reached out instinctively, as if he could touch her, could somehow reach the Emma he had known. But his hand passed through her like smoke, leaving him with nothing but the cold emptiness. "You belong here now," the voice hissed. "You're part of the pact. Forever." David felt the weight of the words, the crushing truth behind them. He was no longer in control. He wasn't just trapped in this place, he had become a part of it. The darkness, the creatures that had once been his loved ones, the curse that had bound them all together. It was all inside him now, a part of him that he couldn't escape. But then, just as the darkness began to close in once more, something stirred within him. A flicker of resistance, a faint voice, his own, whispered into the void. No, he hadn't given up completely. Not yet. With everything in him, David fought back. His mind, his soul, even if it was a faint ember, still burned with the desire to break free. The darkness howled, pressing against him, trying to consume him entirely. But he didn't let go. He reached out, not to the light, not to the creatures, but to himself, to the last shred of humanity left inside him. For a brief moment, the darkness faltered. A crack appeared in its suffocating grip, and through it, David saw something, another light, this time not distant, but just within reach, a way out. With every ounce of strength left, he pushed toward it, his body and mind fighting against the pull of the void. And for the first time since the pact had been sealed, he felt the flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to escape, and if not, Maybe it was enough to know he had fought until the very end. The light grew brighter, searing through the darkness that had held him captive for what felt like an eternity. David's chest heaved as he struggled toward it, his limbs heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. The dark voices, the twisted echoes of John, of Emma, whispered all around him, their words distorted and venomous, but they couldn't drown out the flicker of defiance burning within him. The void fought back, trying to pull him deeper, to drag him into its endless depths. The pressure around him intensified, the suffocating darkness pressing in on all sides. But David didn't falter. He pushed forward, inch by inch, his mind focused on nothing but the light ahead. His breaths were shallow, quick, but he refused to let the fear take hold. He was done running. He was done being a part of the pact. The light pulsated again, more urgently now, like a beacon cutting through the suffocating dark. David's hand reached out, trembling but determined, and for the briefest moment, the shadows loosened their grip, allowing him to take another step forward. He felt it then, the sensation of something breaking, cracking deep within the abyss. The pull of the void weakened for the first time, and as he reached the light, a wave of warmth washed over him, filling his lungs with fresh air. The oppressive, heavy darkness seemed to shrink back, reluctant to let go. But it was too late. David was free. For a fleeting moment, he felt weightless, like he was floating in space, suspended between worlds. The blackness, the horrors, the endless torment, they all faded into the distance, lost to him. Then, as quickly as the void had swallowed him, he was back in the real world. David gasped, his lungs filling with air. The cold, bitter taste of fear lingered in his throat as he stumbled to his feet. His surroundings were dark, but not the same suffocating blackness he had just escaped. The oppressive weight was gone. The room felt normal again, quiet. But then he looked down at his hands. They were shaking, covered in dirt, blood, residue of his struggle. And then the memories flooded back, crashing into him like a wave. Emma, John, the pact, the creatures, the endless darkness. It had all been real, but it was over. He had escaped. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a shaky step forward, unsure of what to expect. The house, his house, was quiet, abandoned almost. The air was stale, heavy with the remnants of everything that had transpired. A distant sound reached his ears. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. David froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned, his mind racing, dreading what he might see. And then he saw her, Emma. But she wasn't herself. Not fully. Her eyes were empty, black as night. Her face pale, hollow, like a ghost of the woman he had loved. She stood in the doorway, watching him with those dark, lifeless eyes. Emma, David whispered, his voice hoarse. You're... She didn't speak. She only smiled, the same twisted grin he had seen before, stretching across her face. It wasn't a smile of love, of relief. It was something darker, something that sent a chill crawling down his spine. The world around him seemed to flicker, as if reality itself was beginning to fray at the edges. You can't escape it, David, she finally said, her voice distorted, unrecognizable. The pact is in you now, forever. David's heart twisted with dread. I won't let it take me again, he said, more to himself than to her. But Emma's grin widened, her form flickering, shifting in and out like a fading memory. You already are, she whispered, her voice fading into the air around him. The light that had saved him, that had pulled him from the void, flickered once more. A distant, faint glow on the horizon. But it was slipping away, fading, consumed by the darkness again. David's heart pounded, the grip of fear tightening once more. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that the true battle had only just begun. He had escaped the void, but he hadn't escaped the pact, and it was coming for him. Again, David's pulse raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he stared at Emma. No, the thing that wore her skin. Her eyes, dark as night, were locked onto him, and the twisted smile on her lips sent a ripple of terror through him. "You don't understand," David whispered, trying to steady his shaking hands. "This isn't you." But Emma's form flickered again, like a broken image on a cracked screen. She was here, but not truly here. Her shape wavered in the dim light, the shadows around her stretching unnaturally long. Her smile grew wider, more grotesque. "Oh, but it is me." The voice that came from her mouth was no longer the soft, familiar tone of his wife. It was jagged, fractured, something other. "I'm exactly what you made me. What you made us." David's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, his legs unsteady. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, caught between the woman he loved and the nightmare she had become. "You can't hide from what you've done, David." Emma's voice echoed in his ears, cold and unfeeling. "You thought you could break the pact, but you can't break what's inside you. You never could." The room around him seemed to warp, the walls closing in, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The light from the distant window flickered and dimmed, leaving the room suffocating in shadows. "No, no, no," David muttered under his breath. "I escaped. But the words died in his throat as he felt the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating him once more. It was everywhere. The same oppressive feeling, the same suffocating weight, the same cold dread. Emma's distorted figure took a step forward, her movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "You're mine now," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with that unsettling, unnatural light. "You belong to the pact, David, just like we all do." David's chest tightened. His breathing was erratic, panicked. "No, I'm not a part of this. I won't let you have me." But the shadows only grew stronger, pressing in from the corners of the room. He could feel them swirling around him, creeping up his legs, clinging to his skin like an invisible force. He wanted to fight, to push the darkness away, but it was too strong. The pull of the pact, of the curse, was too powerful. David fell to his knees, gasping for air. His body was no longer his own. The darkness was inside him now, crawling beneath his skin, winding through his veins. And then, through the suffocating grip of fear and despair, he heard a whisper. Not Emma's, not the thing that had once been John. A different voice, soft, distant, familiar. David, his heart skipped a beat. The voice was his own, or at least it sounded like it. "David, you can still fight it. You can still escape." David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. The voice had come from nowhere, or maybe it had come from within him, a fragment of his former self. The man he had been before the pact had consumed him. "You have to remember who you are," the voice urged him. "You are not just the darkness. You are not just the pact. You are still you." David's chest tightened as his thoughts swirled in a chaotic whirl of fear and confusion. Could it be true? Was there still a part of him that wasn't tainted by the curse? Could he really fight this, even now? He didn't know. He didn't know if he could, but he had to try. He couldn't give up. Not now. With every ounce of willpower left in him, David forced himself to stand, ignoring the icy grip of the shadows around him. His muscles ached, his head spun, but he had to move. He had to fight. The darkness pulled at him harder than before, but he resisted, pushing against it with everything he had. "You don't own me," he screamed, his voice raw with emotion. "I won't let you win." For the briefest moment, the shadows faltered. The pressure around him weakened. And then, in a burst of clarity, David saw it. The flicker of light at the edge of the room, just within his reach. With one final, desperate surge of energy, he lunged toward it, his body shaking with exhaustion and fear. But as his hand reached out to grasp the light, the darkness snapped back, its grip tightening once more. The light flickered, then dimmed. David's eyes went wide with terror. No, it couldn't end like this. And yet, it was slipping through his fingers, faster than he could hold on. The last thing he saw was Emma's face, the empty, hollow smile spreading across her lips. And then, everything went black again. The blackness swallowed him whole, dragging him back into the suffocating void, deeper than before. David's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he thought he might suffocate, his lungs gasping for air, his mind racing with panic. But then, something strange happened. A flicker of warmth spread through him, faint at first, like the soft glow of a dying ember struggling to survive in the dark. He barely registered it, his senses too overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the shadows. But it persisted, a small pulse, a whisper of light in the overwhelming void. David, it was the voice again, his own voice or something like it. But this time, it didn't sound as distant. It was closer, clearer, like a beacon guiding him through the oppressive dark. Don't let go. Fight. David strained against the invisible chains that bound him, the weight of the darkness still pulling at him. But this time, the voice felt stronger. Not just a faint whisper, but a lifeline. The flickering warmth pulsed again, and David realized, with a jolt, that it was coming from within him. It wasn't an external force or some faraway light. It was his own will, his own resolve pushing through the darkness. He wasn't entirely consumed, not yet. He focused on that small ember of warmth, breathing in deeply, willing it to grow. Every part of him wanted to collapse, to give into the suffocating pull of the void, but somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance still burned. Remember who you are, David. You are not them. You are not the pact. With each breath, the warmth grew stronger, brighter. The suffocating grip of the shadows loosening just a little. The oppressive weight on his chest began to lift, and for the first time since the darkness had claimed him, he felt a faint flicker of hope. David gritted his teeth, fighting against the shadows that tried to smother him. He could feel them, those cold tendrils of darkness, clawing at him from every direction, trying to drag him back. But this time he fought harder. This time he refused to let them take him. He reached out again, his hand trembling but determined. The warmth surged within him, expanding outward like a burst of light, pushing back the dark. The shadows writhed and hissed, but they couldn't hold on. The more David concentrated, the stronger the light became, until it flooded every corner of his mind, burning away the last of the void. And then, with one final surge of energy, the darkness shattered. David gasped for air, his body shaking as he was released from the suffocating grip of the void. The blackness that had consumed him was gone, replaced by the soft glow of the room he had once known, his house, the place where everything had started. But it was different now. The walls no longer felt oppressive. The air was no longer thick with dread. He could breathe freely again. David's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of the creatures, any trace of the nightmare that had almost taken him. But it was gone. The pact, the curse, all of it was fading, slipping away like a bad dream. He was free. But as he breathed a sigh of relief, a cold chill crawled up his spine, a lingering feeling of dread settling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't over. Something still lingered in the air, something not entirely right. David turned slowly, his heart in his throat, and saw her. Emma. But this time, she was standing in the doorway, not the twisted, empty version he had seen before. Her eyes, though still dark and hollow, seemed to flicker with some faint trace of recognition. She was there. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like the real Emma was there again, standing before him. But it was fleeting. The moment passed, and the emptiness returned. Her lips parted, and in a voice that was both hers and not, she whispered, "You can't escape it, David." "Not really." David's breath caught in his throat. "I don't have to," he said, his voice firm, though trembling. "I'm free now. I'll fight this. I'll make it stop." Her hollow eyes fixed on him, the smile spreading across her face once more. "You can fight," she said, her voice low, almost pitying. "But the darkness will always find its way back." And with that, the light around David flickered, just for a moment, and then everything went black again. But this time, David wasn't afraid. He knew what he had to do. The true fight was only beginning. David's mind raced as the darkness crept back, its cold fingers tightening around him, trying to pull him into its depths. But something had changed. This time, he could feel it, the resolve within him, burning stronger than before. His body ached, his limbs heavy from exhaustion, but his spirit, his will, was unbroken. He stood tall, feeling the pulse of light deep inside him. It had never truly gone out. It had just been waiting for him to reach it again. To remember that he wasn't alone. Not completely. Not anymore. "You think you've won." Emma's voice echoed through the room, the darkness amplifying her words, making them seem infinite, like they were coming from every direction. David's heart beat faster. Her form wavered again, a haunting distortion, shifting between the familiar woman he had loved and the dark entity that had claimed her. "I didn't win," he said, his voice low but steady, defiant. "I'm not done fighting." Her smile twisted, cruel and mocking. The shadows around her thickened, swirling like smoke, as if they were alive, hungry for him. But David wasn't afraid anymore, not like before. He could feel the power, the strength, deep within himself, rising like a tide. "You can't escape the pact, David. It's in you now. It will never let you go." Her words were a hiss, an attempt to break him down, to make him doubt himself. But he didn't flinch. "No," David said, his voice gaining strength. "It's you who can't escape. Not anymore." With a surge of force, he reached inside, grasping that ember of light within him. His thoughts raced, memories of Emma, of their life together, the love they had shared. He clung to that, knowing that the essence of who they had been could still hold power. He wasn't just fighting the darkness. He was fighting for her, for the love that had once filled their lives. The shadows recoiled, writhing and twisting, as if they felt the burn of his defiance. The light within him grew brighter, pushing the darkness back, little by little. The room trembled, the walls groaning, as though the very foundation was shaking under the force of his will. Emma's form flickered once more, her face distorting into something monstrous. Asterisk, you can't win, asterisk. But David, with everything he had left, screamed back, "Asterisk, I already have, asterisk." In that moment, the light within him erupted, a wave of blinding energy that shattered the darkness, scattering it into nothingness. The room was filled with a brilliant, overwhelming light, the kind that pierced through even the deepest shadows. And for a brief moment, David felt it freedom. He staggered back, his legs weak from the strain, but he stood unwavering. The oppressive atmosphere, the suffocating darkness that had clung to him for so long, was gone. And then he turned to Emma. Her face was still pale, her eyes dark, but something had shifted. The shadows no longer clung to her like they had before. She stood, quiet now, watching him with an unreadable expression. David's chest tightened as he slowly stepped forward. "I didn't want this, Emma," he said, his voice softer now, full of sorrow. "I never wanted any of this. I wanted to save you." She didn't move. Her expression didn't change, but in her eyes, just for a moment, there was a flicker of something human. "Asterisk, you never really understood, did you?" "Asterisk," she whispered, the distortion in her voice still present, but softer, like a memory. The pact, it doesn't just bind us to each other. It binds us to everything. David's heart sank. He knew what she was saying. The darkness, the curse. It wasn't just her. It wasn't just him. It was something far bigger, something older, something that couldn't be so easily undone. But I can stop it, he said, more to himself than to her. I can end it. For both of us. Her eyes met his, those dark, hollow eyes. But in them now, there was something like acceptance. A resignation. She nodded slowly, her lips parting for just a moment, as if to speak, but no words came. David stepped forward again, his resolve stronger than ever. He wouldn't let this curse define them. He wouldn't let the darkness take everything they had. He closed his eyes, reaching deep inside, where that flicker of light still remained. He focused on it, willing it to grow, willing it to burn brighter than the shadows. And as the light intensified, the room began to change. The air felt lighter, clearer. The oppressive weight, the clinging fear, it was slipping away little by little. But as the last of the darkness evaporated, something shifted in the air, something he couldn't quite place. A feeling, a presence, something watching. David froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He wasn't alone, not truly, and somewhere deep within he knew. This wasn't over, not yet. David's heart skipped a beat, the hairs on his neck prickling as an unsettling presence filled the air. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, he stood perfectly still, trying to gauge where it was coming from, but the oppressive feeling seemed to be everywhere, surrounding him, closing in. He turned slowly, eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just the remnants of the fading shadows, the aftertaste of darkness, still lingering in the corners of the walls. And then he felt it. A cold breeze swept through the room, and it wasn't natural. The air around him grew thick again, like something was pushing back, trying to reclaim what had been lost. "Emma," David whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, deep dread. He turned to face her, but she was no longer standing where she had been. The flicker of light that had begun to fade from her eyes was gone. In its place was something darker, something deeper, and the smile that had once haunted him now twisted into something far more sinister. Her form wavered in the air, her features blurring, as if she were caught between two worlds. "You should have listened, David," she said, her voice no longer familiar. It was a low, guttural hiss that echoed from every corner of the room. "The pact, it's never truly broken. It's a part of you now, and a part of me." David's breath caught in his throat as the temperature dropped suddenly, and a chill ran through his veins. His chest tightened. He knew, with a sinking realization, that this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It wasn't just about the darkness or the curse that had once gripped his soul. It was something bigger. The air shimmered in front of him, and through the fog of fear clouding his mind, David saw it. A shape, hovering in the corner of the room, shifting like a shadow, but too vast, too powerful to be contained in one space. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything he recognized. It was something ancient, something alive with the weight of centuries, bound by the pact that had never truly let him go. David's breath came in sharp gasps, his heart pounding as he tried to steady himself. He had fought so hard to escape, to break free from the chains of darkness that had shackled him. But now he understood. There was something deeper, something more entrenched in the world than just the pact between him and Emma. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for his soul. The dark figure in the corner shifted, its form starting to solidify, growing taller, darker, more menacing. Its presence filled the room like a storm, crushing all light in its wake. "You cannot fight what is eternal, David," the voice of the creature rumbled, its tone low and ancient, almost melodic in its malice. "The pact is not something you can break, not so easily. It has existed longer than your fleeting life. David's throat tightened. He took a step back, but the room seemed to close in on him, the walls shifting, the ground under his feet shaking. Asterisk, I will fight, asterisk, his voice was steady, a whisper of defiance. The ember of light within him was still there, still burning faintly, and he clung to it like a lifeline. He couldn't stop now. He couldn't let the darkness win. Not when he had come this far. The figure's eyes, if it had eyes, seemed to pierce into his very soul. "You can try, David," it said, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "But the light will never be enough. You were never meant to win." David clenched his fists, feeling the energy within him surge again. But this time it felt different. This was no longer just a fight against the darkness. It was a war against something far older, far more powerful, something that had existed before him. Asterisk, I will find a way, asterisk, David whispered, his voice barely audible, but his conviction stronger than ever. I will destroy it. I will end this. The dark presence let out a low, rumbling laugh, sending a chill through David's spine. You are just a man, David. Nothing more than the pact you made. The darkness will always return. You belong to it now. David's thoughts raced. He had to be stronger. He had to fight. This wasn't just about breaking free anymore. It was about ending the cycle, destroying whatever this entity was once and for all. He clenched his fists tighter, feeling the warmth of the light grow within him. He wasn't going to let this thing win. Not after everything he had already fought for. I don't belong to you, David said, his voice firm, his heart pounding in his chest. The darkness seemed to ripple with anticipation, swirling around him. The air grew heavier again, colder. Asterisk will see asterisk, the voice of the entity whispered, its presence pressing in on him like an invisible hand. Asterisk will see asterisk, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. For a moment, the room fell silent. The shadows receded, and the overwhelming presence lifted, leaving David alone with his thoughts, his heart still racing. But David knew the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. The entity had retreated, but it hadn't been defeated. And deep down, David knew something even more terrifying. The pact was not just a curse. It was a curse that could never be undone. And as long as the darkness lived, as long as the pact lingered in the shadows, it would always come back. And so would he. David stood in the silence that followed, the weight of his breath the only sound in the room. His muscles were tight, his body trembling from the intensity of the confrontation. But even in the quiet, he could feel the remnants of the darkness lingering, biding its time. The wall seemed to close in on him, almost imperceptibly, the air growing heavier again. He wasn't free, not truly, no matter how hard he fought. The pact was a force beyond his understanding, beyond his control. It had always been there, lurking in the background, waiting for the right moment to rise again. The faint pulse of light within him flickered, barely holding on. His connection to it felt fragile now, as if it could slip away at any moment. He didn't know how much longer he could keep fighting, but one thing was certain. He couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. David's gaze darted around the room, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, for any sign of movement. The air felt thick, charged, like the very fabric of reality had been torn. Something was waiting, and then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a figure appeared in the doorway. Emma. She was standing there again, but this time there was no flicker of recognition in her eyes, no trace of humanity. Her features were hollow, her expression vacant, but something about her presence sent a chill down David's spine. She wasn't fully gone, not yet. Her voice came, soft and cold, echoing through the silence. You can't save me, David. You can't save yourself. David's heart twisted as he took a step forward, his hands trembling. I can't just leave you like this. You're still in there, Emma. I know you are. But she didn't respond. Her gaze, empty and cold, never wavered. The shadows seemed to follow her, clinging to her form like an old, familiar friend. David could feel the pull, the weight of the darkness trying to creep into his mind again, feeding on his doubt, his fear. It wanted him to give in, to believe that there was no way out, that the pact had already won. No, David whispered, shaking his head. I won't let it take me. I won't give in. He reached for the light within him, pulling it to the surface, drawing it out, willing it to burn brighter, stronger. He had fought too long, too hard, to let it all slip away now. Emma's empty eyes seemed to follow his every move, and her lips parted once more. You're running out of time, David. It's already too late. Her voice echoed in his mind, growing louder, drowning out his thoughts, like a constant chant. Asterisk, it's too late. You can't win. The darkness is already inside you. There's no escaping it, asterisk. David clenched his fists, fighting against the suffocating pull of her words. He had to push back. He couldn't let the darkness win. He couldn't let it consume him. Consume her. Not after everything they had been through. But as he focused on the light inside him, it felt distant, fading. His strength was draining, his energy spent, and the weight of the shadows pressing in on him became too much to bear. For a moment, David faltered, doubt creeping into his mind. Asterisk, what if she's right? What if I can't do this? Asterisk. But then he heard it again, a whisper, soft but steady, his own voice, deep within his mind. Don't stop. Don't let them take you. It was the same voice that had spoken to him earlier, the voice of his own willpower, his own strength. It was the only thing left that was truly his. The pact couldn't take that. With a final, desperate cry, David pushed the darkness back, forcing the light inside him to flare, to burst out in a brilliant wave that cut through the shadows, blinding him for a moment. When the light finally subsided, David found himself standing alone in the room, his breath ragged, his body shaking from the strain. The darkness was gone. The oppressive weight had lifted. But Emma was gone too. For a moment, David stood frozen, staring at the empty space where she had been. It felt like something inside him had shattered, like he had lost her all over again. And yet, there was a small, flickering hope. The darkness hadn't won. He had resisted. He had fought for what was left of her, what was left of himself. But as he slowly turned away, the hair on the back of his neck prickled again. A cold sensation crept down his spine, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The room had changed once more. The walls were no longer just walls. They felt alive, like they were watching him, pressing in on him, waiting for the next step. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, no longer inanimate. They were moving alive, conscious. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, David heard a whisper. Asterisk, it's not over. It will never be over, asterisk. The room began to warp around him, the very air distorting, as if reality itself was bending to the will of the darkness. David's heart pounded in his chest, but this time he didn't run. He couldn't. The battle wasn't finished, and in the depths of his soul, he knew the pact would never truly let him go. David's breath quickened as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows now swirling with an unnatural hunger. The temperature dropped once more, the cold biting at his skin like 1,000 needles. He could hear the faint whispers growing louder, voices from nowhere, yet everywhere at once. Asterisk, it's not over. It will never be over, asterisk. The words slithered through his mind, chilling him to his core. His heart raced, and for a fleeting moment, he thought of running. But he knew better. The moment he turned his back, the darkness would swallow him whole. He had fought so hard to escape it, But now, standing in the midst of it, he realized the truth. The pact, the curse, it wasn't just something external. It was woven into the very fabric of his being. It had followed him, attached itself to him in ways he hadn't fully understood. It wasn't just Emma he had been trying to save. It was himself. The shadows hissed, a low growl rising from the depths of the room. The figure that had once been Emma, or had been something pretending to be her, was now just a blur, fading into the growing darkness, as if she had never truly been there at all. David's fingers tightened around the last spark of light inside him, but it felt distant, like trying to hold onto a flame in a storm. The warmth inside him flickered, barely alive. He could feel the entity's presence closing in around him. It was no longer just a force. It was a thing, a living, breathing nightmare that had taken root in the very space between breaths. The shadows moved like tendrils reaching for him, drawing closer with every passing second. "You can't escape," the voice rumbled, the low tone vibrating through his bones. "You never could." David's mind raced, searching for something, anything. The darkness was everywhere now, warping reality, tearing apart the edges of the world he had once known. He could feel it crawling beneath his skin, twisting around his thoughts. But there was something else, too. A whisper, soft, barely there. The light. It was still inside him, still fighting to burn, even though the shadows tried to smother it. The ember that had once been his only hope was still there. It hadn't gone out completely. Not yet. David inhaled sharply, his hand trembling as he reached for it once more. His mind screamed for him to fight, to not let go. But the weight of the darkness was pressing in, forcing him to his knees. "You cannot defeat me," the voice whispered again, this time closer, as if it were right beside him. "I am the end of all things. I am the shadow in every heart, the silence in every scream. I am the pact that binds you, David," his heart hammered in his chest. The words twisted inside him, but he clung to the light. The flicker of warmth was so small, so fragile, but it was all he had left. He couldn't let it die, not like this. In the distance, through the haze of fear and uncertainty, he saw it. A door, a small, faintly glowing door in the far corner of the room, barely visible through the thickening darkness. It seemed impossibly far away, but it was there. It was a way out. His pulse quickened as he pushed himself to his feet, fighting against the weight of the shadows that seemed to pull at him with every step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at his mind. "Don't go, David. You can't escape me," the voice hissed, but it was no longer just one voice. It was a chorus of voices, each one more insistent than the last. He took a step forward, then another. His body ached with the effort, every step a struggle, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to reach the door. The darkness closed in faster, faster than he could move. He could feel its tendrils wrapping around his ankles, his legs, pulling him down, but he fought against it with everything he had. The door, he was so close now. The light inside him surged, a flicker of warmth in the crushing cold. He stretched out his hand, reaching for the handle, his fingers just barely grazing it. Asterisk, I can't stop. I won't stop, asterisk. And then the door swung open. A wave of light, blinding and pure, flooded through the room, shattering the shadows that had once filled it. The tendrils of darkness recoiled, hissing and screeching in fury, but they couldn't stop the light. David stumbled forward, his hand gripping the doorframe, pulling himself through the threshold. He felt the darkness fighting him, pulling at him, but the light was stronger now, stronger than the fear, stronger than the whispers. As the door slammed shut behind him, the last of the shadows seemed to dissipate. The air was clearer, the weight lifting from his chest, the suffocating presence of the entity gone. David collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body trembling, his mind reeling. For a moment, he thought he had escaped. He thought it was finally over. But as he slowly looked around, he realized where he was. It wasn't his house. The room was familiar in a way he couldn't place. Cold stone walls, low ceilings, flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows. It was old, ancient even. And something in the air, something about this place, made his skin crawl. David's breath caught in his throat. There was a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was her again, Emma. But this time, she was no longer a wisp of darkness. She was fully there, standing in the light, her eyes empty and hollow. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice like a broken echo. David's heart sank as he realized. The door hadn't let him out. It had led him deeper. That David's blood ran cold as he stared at Emma. Her form was no longer flickering between shadow and light, but solid, unyielding. Her eyes, those hollow, vacant eyes, locked onto his with a coldness that made his stomach churn. The room around him seemed to close in tighter, as if the walls themselves were watching him, waiting for the next move. For a moment, all he could do was breathe, each inhale coming in short, shallow gasps. He had hoped, prayed even, that the darkness would finally release its grip on him. But standing here now, in this strange, dimly lit place, he realized that his escape had only led him deeper into the nightmare. Emma didn't move. She just stood there, silent, her gaze never leaving him. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the stone walls, making the room feel even more claustrophobic. A cold draft swirled through the air, the faintest echo of a whisper brushing against David's skin, almost too quiet to hear. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and filled with something darker than he had ever heard before. It was a voice stripped of emotion, of humanity, as if whatever had been left of her was now completely consumed. David's heart hammered in his chest. He knew he had to act. The room, the walls, the very air around him, everything was wrong. His instinct screamed that he was trapped, that every choice had led him to this point. There was no escape. Not this time. "What is this place?" he forced himself to ask, his voice trembling, though he hated how weak it sounded. He couldn't let her see him break. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is where it all ends. Where it begins." David's blood ran cold. A chill deeper than the one in the air settled into his bones. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him with a truth he didn't want to face. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead, the floor beneath him solid, unmoving. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of here, but there was nowhere to go. The room felt like a cage, and he was the prey. Emma took a step forward, her movements slow, deliberate. Each step echoed in the silence like the ticking of a clock, counting down to something inevitable. "You're not the first to try, you know," she continued, her voice growing colder, more distant with every word. "Many have come before you. All have failed. They thought they could outrun the darkness. But it's never just a fight against what's outside, David. It's a fight against what's inside." David swallowed hard, the reality of her words sinking in. The pact, the curse, it wasn't just about breaking free from her. It was about something far more insidious, something that had been a part of him all along. "No," David whispered, shaking his head. "I won't let it win. I won't let it take me again." Emma's smile deepened, her gaze unblinking as she took another step closer. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, twisting and warping around her, filling the space with an almost tangible presence. The darkness had a weight now, like it was pressing down on him, inching closer with every breath. "You don't get it, do you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more intimate. "You were never meant to escape. The darkness never left you, David. It was inside you all along. It's why we were bound together in the first place. You think you can fight it, but it's a part of your soul. You can never outrun yourself. David's knees buckled, his body giving in to the crushing weight of her words. He could feel the dark presence inside him, the cold tendrils of fear and doubt creeping into his mind. His thoughts became muddled, clouded, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he could fight anymore. But then, deep inside, there was a spark. Faint, barely a whisper of warmth, but it was enough. The light, his light, the one he had fought to protect. He clenched his fists, summoning whatever strength he had left. The light flickered, growing in intensity, burning against the cold, suffocating grip of the darkness. Emma's form flickered for a brief second, her features warping, as if the darkness that surrounded her was trying to reclaim her. She hissed a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down David's spine. "No," she snarled. "You can't fight what's already inside you." David stood taller, refusing to let her words consume him. He wasn't just fighting the darkness. He was fighting for the last shred of humanity left in him, the last spark of hope, of love, of Emma. He reached for the light within him again, pushing harder, forcing it to burn brighter. The shadows recoiled, but they came back, thicker, more desperate, as if they could feel the heat of his resistance. His pulse was racing, the light inside him flaring like a firestorm, pushing back the oppressive weight of the darkness. Emma's eyes flashed with something that almost resembled fear, but before David could react, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to distort, bending inward as the air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural pressure. The shadows came rushing at him from all sides, like a wave crashing down, faster and more violent than before. David gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. This was it, the final stand, the moment when everything would either break or be reborn. The darkness closed in, and then, just as it seemed like the light would fade, David heard it. A sound, sharp and clear, like a scream. A woman's voice, distant but unmistakable. David. It wasn't Emma's voice. David's breath caught in his throat. The sound came again, louder this time. David, you're not alone. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years. And in that instant, David realized something that shook him to his core. The darkness wasn't just inside him. It was waiting for him to accept it. And he wasn't the only one who had been bound to it. The voice echoed again, more distinct this time, pulling David's attention away from the suffocating darkness around him. David, you're not alone. The words were familiar, soothing, almost like a memory that had been buried too deep to reach. His heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be. He turned, his body stiff, his gaze darting through the dim room, searching for the source of the voice. His mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a desperate frenzy. Who was it? The shadows seemed to retreat for just a moment, as though they were waiting for him to understand something. The room, the darkness, it all felt wrong. But the voice, it was real, Star. It was someone. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, hazy at first, a wisp of light through the dense fog of blackness. It was faint, like a dream, but it grew stronger with each passing second. The shape began to solidify, and David's breath caught in his throat. It was her, not Emma, not the hollow, broken version that had haunted him all this time. This was someone else, someone he had known long ago. Sarah. Her figure stepped forward, her face soft but strained, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a fierce determination. She was real. She was real, Star. The light around her shimmered with an ethereal glow, not like the flickering flames of the candles that lined the walls, but a light that seemed to cut through the darkness itself. Sarah. David's voice trembled, but the sound of her name gave him the strength he needed to speak. How are you here? Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, The world seemed to still. The shadows surrounding them pulsed with a strange rhythm, as if the room itself were breathing, and the air crackled with energy, tension thick enough to be felt on his skin. "I never left," she finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I've been here, waiting for you." David felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Confusion, relief, fear, and then something even deeper. Something he had buried for years. Sarah. She was the one he had lost, the one he had failed to save. But her presence here now was a contradiction. How could she be here, in this place of shadows and curses? How had she survived the pact when he had been dragged into its darkness? I thought you were. He couldn't finish the sentence. The words caught in his throat, as if saying them aloud would make the truth even more unbearable. Her eyes softened with something like understanding. "I was never meant to be part of it, David, but I was close enough to be pulled in, just like you." David's mind reeled. What did she mean? Before he could ask, she raised a hand, a gesture that seemed both protective and gentle. "You don't understand it all yet," she continued. "You never did. But this place, the pact, the curse, it isn't just tied to you, David. It's tied to us." The air around them seemed to shift, the shadows swirling as if responding to her words. David felt the weight of her statement settle over him like a heavy fog. "The pact didn't just bind you to Emma," she explained, her voice growing more intense. "It bound all of us together, all those who loved, who cared for each other. We are all connected by this dark thread, David." David felt his heart drop into his stomach. Asterisk, it's not just Emma. It's not just me, asterisk. The realization hit him like a cold wave. The darkness wasn't a singular entity. It wasn't just one curse, one shadow. It was a force that fed on love, on loss, on the very connections that made them human. And Sarah, she was somehow tied to it, just like he was. "Why didn't you leave?" His voice was barely a whisper, full of pain. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I tried," she said, her voice trembling. "I tried to protect you, David, but I couldn't fight it alone." And now she looked around, her expression darkening, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on her. "Now it's too late for me." David reached out instinctively, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "It's too late for both of us, David. The darkness will never let us go. It knows us too well." He wanted to scream. He wanted to wake up from this nightmare, to run, to escape. But the realization crushed him. There was nowhere to run. The pact had never been just a binding curse. It had been a connection, a tether that had tied their fates together. "Sarah, please," his voice cracked, desperate. "Tell me what to do." "I don't know what to do anymore." She didn't answer right away. She stood still, her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, David thought she might simply fade away again. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she spoke. "Asterisk, you have to face it, asterisk," she said, her words final, almost resigned. "You can't run from it anymore. You've been running for so long, trying to outrun the darkness inside you. But it's a part of you, David, and it always will be. The only way out is through." David felt his blood run cold. Through, what did that mean? But as her words echoed in his mind, something shifted in him. The light inside him, the flickering ember, was still there. It wasn't gone. It wasn't dead. It wasn't just for fighting. It was for understanding. Sarah's figure began to fade, dissolving back into the shadows. "You can end it, David," she whispered, the voice fading as if it were being pulled from him. "But you must face what you are. You must face us." And then she was gone. David stood in the silence that followed, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room felt darker than ever, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The light inside him flickered again, a small, fragile flame, but it was enough. This was the only way left. David closed his eyes, his hand gripping the light deep inside, ready to face what had always been waiting.